It was a regular morning at Chase Bank in Brooklyn. Keyboards clattered, bills shuffled through counting machines, and conversations buzzed across the marble-floored lobby. The glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. At first, no one noticed the man who stepped inside. He wore a faded canvas jacket, its sleeves frayed, its color long turned to dust. His shoes carried the memory of long walks. In his hand was a canvas bag, worn, stained, and tied shut with an old piece of cord, something that looked more at home in a war museum than a bank. He didn't rush. He didn't look lost. He walked straight toward the main counter, passing by young professionals checking their phones and retirees waiting for appointments. His voice wasn't loud, but it landed with quiet weight. "This bank is mine," he said. For a moment, nothing changed. Then a faint chuckle rippled through the line. A young man in a hoodie smirked without lifting his eyes from his phone. Behind the counter, a teller blinked, uncertain whether she heard correctly. The security guard, a broad-shouldered white man in his 40s, looked up and began to approach. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, tone polite but firm. The old man didn't flinch. "I'm not lost," he replied. "I built this place in 1948. But my name isn't on the wall anymore, is it?" Now the laughter faded. Heads turned. The teller glanced toward the back office and picked up the phone. The guard's body shifted slightly, stepping closer, one hand hovering near his radio. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside unless you have business here today." The man didn't move. He looked up at the framed photos lining the back wall, portraits of white men in suits, each labeled Founder. His eyes paused at the oldest one, a black and white image from 1949. No one in the room recognized him. But something about the stillness of his stance, the way he held that bag, kept the guard from grabbing his arm. A young bank employee whispered, "Should we call the cops?" James Temp, the bank manager, had just begun descending the back stairwell, alerted by the quiet tension. What no one noticed was the man's hands, steady, folded neatly atop the weathered strap of his bag. Not clenched in protest, not trembling in fear. And that was the moment when everything started to shift. Not because he raised his voice, but because he never had to. This time, the man they dismissed was the one holding the weight of the room. James Temp approached with the kind of professional smile one learns after years of dealing with upset customers. He had managed this branch for over a decade. He'd seen people yell, cry, even threaten lawsuits. But never before had someone walked in and calmly declared ownership of the entire bank. Still, he kept his tone measured, adjusting his tie slightly as he spoke. "Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. This branch has always been part of the Matthews family holdings. The records go back to the early 1950s. I can assure you." "There's no misunderstanding," the man interrupted, his voice even. "I built it, with my own two hands." James hesitated. The claim was absurd, but the man wasn't ranting or unhinged. He stood with a quiet certainty, the kind that made it hard to dismiss him outright. A few customers had paused their conversations. A teller behind the glass leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on the exchange. "My name is Elijah C.K. Kirby," he continued. "I started this bank with a man named John Williams. We built it together, but then they erased me, took my name off the papers, off the deeds, off the history. All I had left was what I kept." James raised a hand slightly toward the security guard, signaling caution. Elijah wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, but the room had shifted. There was something uncomfortable in the air, not danger, but doubt. "I understand your concern," James said, trying to maintain control. "But those are serious claims, and I'm afraid there's no documentation that supports. You haven't seen everything yet." Elijah placed his hand on the strap of his old canvas bag. He didn't open it. He didn't create drama. It was a slow, quiet gesture, one that felt practiced, deliberate. The kind of movement you make when you've waited decades to be heard. For some in the room, especially those with gray hair and lined faces, his words struck a deeper chord. They had seen names erased, credit denied, entire stories rewritten with the stroke of a pen. They had learned that truth didn't always make it into official records. And for them, Elijah wasn't just a man with a strange claim. He was someone they recognized in a way the younger crowd couldn't. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for sympathy. He stood with the posture of someone who had carried silence too long and finally decided to set it down. James, still trying to retain his composure, felt the shift in the room. Not everyone believed Elijah. But no one was laughing anymore. And somewhere deep inside, as Elijah met his gaze, James felt the first flicker of doubt. Not about the man in front of him, but about the history he had always trusted to be true. The tension tightened as Elijah reached into his bag. The room, once filled with quiet background noise, now seemed to hold its breath. The security guard stepped closer, hand near his belt, voice low but sharp. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop right there. Let's not make this into something it doesn't have to be." Elijah paused, looked at the man calmly, and said nothing. He continued opening the flap of the bag, slow and steady. The guard's voice rose slightly, tone edging toward command. "Don't make me ask again. You need to step back and leave." That's when it came, quietly, but with weight. "You can call me whatever you want," Elijah said, eyes steady on the guard. "But what you call me doesn't change the truth. It never has." The words didn't echo, but they landed. The guard blinked, thrown off by the lack of defiance. He was used to pushback, to confrontation. But Elijah didn't match that energy. He wasn't trying to win a fight. He was just stating a fact. Across the room, people stopped pretending not to watch. An older black woman in the corner tightened her grip on her purse, her eyes fixed on Elijah with a kind of quiet recognition. A young teller, barely out of college, glanced nervously at James Temp, who remained still, uncertain of what to say next. Elijah kept going. "For 50 years I've been called names. Trouble, liar, thief, boy. That never made me any of those things. I was born with a name. I built something with that name. And I lost it, not because I did anything wrong, but because the man I trusted couldn't stand the idea of standing next to me in a photograph." The guard didn't move. Elijah wasn't reaching for a weapon. He wasn't threatening anyone. But the moment still felt dangerous, not because of violence, but because of truth. It's a strange kind of fear that settles into a room when people realize their assumptions might be wrong. That maybe the man they dismissed, the one in the frayed jacket with the steady voice, wasn't confused or bitter or lost. Maybe he had just been waiting. The bag sat half open on the counter now. Elijah didn't reach further in. Not yet. He stood, hands resting on the canvas like it held more than paper or proof. Like it held a version of the past no one else was ready to carry. No one spoke, and Elijah didn't need them to. Because in that moment, surrounded by doubt, judgment, and silence, he reminded the room of something deeply uncomfortable. The truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be said. Elijah reached into the bag and slowly pulled out a leather-bound ledger. The cover was worn and cracked with age, the corners softened by time. He placed it gently on the counter, then opened it to a specific page. No hesitation, no fumbling. He knew exactly where to go. "This," he said quietly, "is the original ledger from 1948, before the bank had a name, before the logo, before the marble floors, back when it was just two men and a single idea." He turned the book toward James Temp and pointed to the bottom of the page. In faded black ink, a signature stretched across the yellowed paper. Elijah C.K. Kirby, founder. Next to it, another name, John M. Williams, co-founder. For a moment, James said nothing. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the page, then glanced up at Elijah. The name matched. The handwriting was deliberate, strong. It didn't look forged. It didn't look like a prank. The security guard stepped closer, peering over the counter. His earlier confidence wavered, just slightly. Behind him, a few customers moved closer too, drawn by something they didn't fully understand. "That signature," Elijah said, "was made the day we opened the account that funded this building. We pooled everything we had, me with savings from construction work and war wages, and John, whose family had access to loans I couldn't touch." He paused, then added, "And I wasn't the one who walked away." There was no anger in his voice, just weight. History made personal, pain delivered with precision. He wasn't looking for pity. He was naming something that had been left nameless for too long. James looked again at the ledger. His hands, now resting on the counter, were tense. "Where did you get this?" "I kept it," Elijah replied, "because I knew someday someone would ask the wrong question, and I'd finally have the right page to show them." Across the room, you could feel the temperature change. This wasn't just a claim anymore. It was a challenge to memory, to records, to the kind of history that's told only by those who win. And now, for the first time, the man in the ragged jacket wasn't just a disturbance. He was someone who had once mattered. And maybe still did. Elijah reached into the canvas bag once more. This time, what he pulled out wasn't a ledger. It was a bundle of old currency, paper bills, faded and fragile, wrapped neatly in string. The bills bore a logo no longer in circulation, an early emblem of what would eventually become Chase Bank. The color had dulled with time, the edges curled, but the ink still whispered of a different era. He placed the stack gently on the counter. "These were the first deposits," he said. "Back when every dollar had a name behind it, mine." No one spoke. James stared at the bills, then at Elijah. The guard stood still, arms at his sides now, unsure of his role in a moment that felt larger than policy or protocol. A young man in line pulled out his phone instinctively, then hesitated. Something about this didn't feel right to film. It felt like something you were supposed to witness, quietly. "This isn't about the money," Elijah continued. "It's about the fact that for half a century, I've lived with proof in my hands while people told me I didn't exist." He glanced at the bills, then added, "Money is supposed to measure value, but when a man's name is removed from what he helped create, no amount of money can make up for that." Across the lobby, a woman in her 60s wiped at her cheek with a tissue. She'd come in to cash a check. Now she stood frozen, watching a man who looked like her father might have, dignified, soft-spoken, tired of being ignored. James looked down at the stack again. He didn't want to touch it. Not out of disrespect, but because he knew, the moment he did, it would stop being theoretical. It would become real. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He just stood there beside old bills and older wounds, asking one simple thing: to be remembered. And for the first time that morning, the people in the room weren't seeing a man trying to cause trouble. They were seeing someone who had already lived through it. Someone who had returned, not to take back what was lost, but to make sure it would never be forgotten again. Elijah reached once more into the bag and pulled out a second ledger, smaller, bound in dark brown leather, with a faded strap barely holding it together. He opened it to a page near the middle and turned it toward James. The ink here was different. Where the original ledger had careful black script, this one bore hurried red strokes. Aggressive, rushed, the handwriting no longer collaborative, but corrective. "Here's where it happened," Elijah said, tapping the page. "Right here. This is the day John Williams signed a document removing my name from the founding charter. No meeting, no vote, just ink. Red ink. As if erasing me was just a clerical update." James read the note silently. "Transfer of principal interest from ECK to JMW, confirmed and finalized. August 11, 1949. No mention of Elijah's consent, no signature from him. Just initials. Just silence. They told me it was for convenience," Elijah continued. "That it would be easier for the bank to secure funding without my name on the paperwork. They said it was temporary. They told me to be patient." He looked up, and his voice lowered, not in volume but in weight. But it wasn't patience they wanted. It was my absence. There was no outrage in his face, only exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from a day or even a year, but from half a lifetime of being erased on paper and then in person. The room held still. Customers had stopped pretending to scroll their phones. Some leaned in, others stared blankly, processing what they were seeing. This wasn't just an old man with documents. This was someone bringing receipts not for money, but for betrayal. James felt something shift in his chest. He had read about cases like this in training, filed under rare exceptions, and buried footnotes. But none of that prepared him for the weight of watching a man confront a system that had buried him while still smiling to the public. The red ink on that page wasn't just a signature. It was a wound. And for the first time, James realized it had never dried. Elijah looked straight at James, the lines in his face firm but not cold. His hands rested atop the worn ledger, fingers lightly tapping the edge. No urgency, no threat, just a steady presence that had carried too many years of silence. "I'm not here to tear this place down," he said. "I'm not here to demand a payout or make a scene. I came to remind you, someone needs to say it out loud before it gets buried for good." James opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no protocol for this. No bullet point on the training manual that covered a man showing up with 70-year-old ledgers and a voice that didn't shake. "I'm not blaming you," Elijah continued, his voice low. "You weren't the one who took it, but today you are the one standing between what happened and whether it ever gets recognized." A beat of silence passed, then another. The room had fallen into full stillness now. The employees no longer pretended to work. Customers didn't check their watches. Everyone was waiting, not for what Elijah would say next, but for how James would respond. "You know I'm telling the truth," Elijah said, softer this time, "even if the records don't, even if your job tells you to act like I'm not." James swallowed hard. He glanced down at the documents again, at the signature, the red ink, the brittle currency. It wasn't just evidence, it was a reckoning. And it was sitting on the countertop of his branch on a quiet Wednesday morning. What he felt, more than disbelief, was shame. Not his own exactly, but the weight of an institution that had taught him to never ask certain questions. And now, one of those questions was looking him straight in the eye. "You know," Elijah said again, "some folks steal a man's wallet. Others steal the years he gave to something. You can get the wallet back, but those years, those only come with acknowledgement." James didn't move. His face wasn't hard anymore. It was something else now, something closer to human, something struggling between responsibility and reflex. And Elijah, he didn't press further. He didn't have to, because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is stop asking and start waiting. Elijah stood a little straighter now. He wasn't leaning on the counter or clinging to anything for support. The bag lay open beside him. The ledgers rested in full view. But his hands were free, almost as if the weight they carried had finally been shared. "I didn't come here to take back the bank," he said quietly, but with clarity that reached every corner of the room. "I came to take back my name. I came to remind you I was here, that I mattered." James didn't speak. No one did. Elijah let the silence breathe. "For years I stayed quiet. I watched other men hang their pictures on the wall. I watched my story fade behind plaques and polished glass. But I didn't forget. I was waiting for the right day to remember out loud." There was no bitterness in his tone, no spite, only conviction, quiet, sharp, and undeniable. "I don't need your apology," Elijah added. "I don't need you to fix what was stolen. You can't. But I do need someone, anyone, to stop pretending it never happened." A young employee behind the desk blinked fast, as if trying to process history rewriting itself in real time. An older gentleman in line, veteran's cap on his head, nodded slowly, not to Elijah but to himself. He'd seen this kind of quiet dignity before. Usually in cemeteries, sometimes in courtrooms, rarely in banks. James finally spoke, though barely above a whisper. "Mr. Kirby." But Elijah raised a hand, not to interrupt, but to finish. "I'm not here to be honored. I'm here to be remembered. That's enough for me." Then he stepped back from the counter. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He didn't pack up the ledgers. He left them there on the cold granite surface, open, visible, undeniable. And for the first time, the bank didn't feel like a place of numbers or contracts. It felt like a place where something had just been returned, not physically, but morally. Not with signatures, but with truth. Elijah didn't look back. He didn't need to, because what he came for had already begun to settle, like dust, finally allowed to rest on something real. Elijah walked toward the door with the same quiet confidence he had entered with. No one stopped him. No one moved. It wasn't fear that kept them still. It was reverence. The kind of reverence that rises when truth fills a room so completely, there's no space left for interruption. The security guard who had once blocked his path now stepped aside, eyes lowered, shoulders slack. A few customers turned to follow Elijah with their gaze, but not their feet. They seemed to understand instinctively that this was not a moment to crowd. It was a moment to carry. James Temp remained behind the counter, the ledgers still open in front of him. His hand hovered just inches above the page, but he didn't touch it. Not yet. Not until he could be sure he was ready to feel the full weight of what it represented. The bank, for all its structure and order, had been disrupted. Not by chaos, not by threat, but by something far harder to dismiss. Remembrance. No one in the room would forget what they saw. Not the proof, not the names. But more than that, not the way Elijah stood without needing to shout. Not the way he carried history like it was something sacred, not bitter. Outside, the door closed softly behind him. He didn't look back. His shoulders didn't sag. His pace didn't quicken. He just walked, steady, dignified, alone. Later that week, the photo wall behind the teller desk would change. Not dramatically, just one new frame. A sepia-toned image of a younger Elijah Kirby in a wool coat standing in front of the original building in 1948. No caption, no ceremony, but everyone who worked there would know. And more importantly, they would remember. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. It doesn't come with headlines or court rulings. Sometimes it arrives quietly. It walks in wearing an old jacket, speaks with calm certainty, and leaves behind a truth too solid to deny. If you've ever been dismissed because of how you looked, how you spoke, or what they assumed about you, remember this. Truth doesn't have to shout. It only has to be spoken at the right moment. Comment 1 if you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Comment 2 if you believe dignity and truth still have a place in this world.